Good afternoon. I'm Kay Jacobson, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Libraries, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the popular ongoing presidential series created by historian J.B. Andersen. Today's talk is still focusing on our 12th president, Abraham Lincoln, and today's program is also brought to you not only by the Ramsey County Libraries, but our co-sponsor with Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota. And we're deeply grateful to both of these organizations for making this possible. So without any further ado, I'm going to be turning things over to our speaker, JB Andersen. Take it away, JB.
Where we're going to begin today is with a question from last week, and it was about any interesting books on Lincoln that I'd recommend, and I couldn't think of anything off the top of my head. But here are three possibilities. All three of them are considered classics. They are not things that have been published recently. So let's take a look at those. First is, excuse me, there. A Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin. It's available on Amazon, although you can order it through any bookstore. Amazon's price is $18.99 in paperback. You can see there's a couple of different versions of it there that you can order. She's a historian who writes biographies. Biographies are considered a part of the movement within history known as the great person theory, that historical events occur as the result of great people doing things. Goodwin has a PhD in history, but she is a non-academic. She spent much of her career doing political commentary, but started out for the first few years as a sports journalist and has become a very recognized historian. There was a controversy in her career about plagiarism, but that has not reflected negatively on her books or her book sales. So, Team of Rivals, feel free to write this down. I can go over them quickly again, but near the end of the week when this is available online for you, you can come in and look at them again. But number one, if you're writing, Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin. Second book we're going to talk about is a general biography of Lincoln. And I'm going to go back to Doris Kearns Goodwin and just say this Team of Rivals is about Lincoln's cabinet. And he appointed several Democrats. He wanted to be communicating with Democrats. So this is about political relationships that Lincoln had. This is a general biography of Lincoln, simply titled Lincoln. It's by David Herbert Donald. He's a professor at, or was a professor at Harvard University. He died in 2009. Goodwin is now 82 years old, so you can see these are people that have written books that are well established. Available on Amazon in paperback for $28.66. The third and final book after Lincoln by David Herbert Donald is Lincoln at Gettysburg, The Words That Remade America by Gary Wills. Gary Wills is still alive. He's 90 years old. He's a journalist. Frequently, when people compare journalists with college professors, they say that the journalists have much more readable books. They grab your attention a lot better. That's what journalists are known for. Academic historians That is, college professors frequently are writing and thinking about colleagues and aiming their stories at colleagues. And so Wills is what's known as a popular writer of history, and he's 90 years old. 1799 for this hardcover called Lincoln at Gettysburg. So it's a combination. It's kind of a Lincoln speech and military history. Now let's get back to the main points in the lecture. And we're going to start talking about the Civil War today, which lasted from 1861 to 1865, 4 years. Research has been done on wars, and they find that when a war gets to be about 5 years old, populations begin to lose interest. So leadership likes to keep wars less than 5 years old. So what's Lincoln's strategy for the Civil War? Now, last week when we met, we talked about Lincoln managing the Civil War. This is different. This is a strategy for winning the Civil War. Number one, there are 7 items here that we're going to discuss. Keep foreign nations out of the Civil War. You know, when you're a country and there's infighting going on within your borders, such as a civil war, that's a great time for other countries to come and attack you because you're having a lot of internal problems. This has been the history of Europe, a bunch of small nations and lots of infighting. When France started its revolution, England attacks France. They go, this is the time when we can take over France or a huge chunk of it, simply because they're having a lot of internal problems. Their nobility's being killed off by people who are revolting against the French government, etc. So anyway, keep foreign nations out of the Civil War was Lincoln's first strategy. Second, he was commander-in-chief of the military. Now, frequently that meant they could move generals around in terms of rank, and they could make some military decisions, take information to Congress if they wanted to declare war, although that hasn't happened for over 80 years now. But Lincoln changed this. He started playing a large part in planning a war effort. Previous presidents had not done that. They pretty much turned it over to generals. Third, Lincoln's had a high priority for defending Washington, D.C. If the capital of your country or your section of the country, as was the case in the Civil War, if that capital is conquered by the enemy, that's a big loss, both psychologically and militarily. And it's what happened with the South when the capital city, Richmond, Virginia, of the South, got taken over by the North. So defend Washington, D.C. That will aid greatly in maintaining the federal government, which is necessary in the prosecution of the war. Item number 4 of Lincoln's strategies was, let's get this over with. Let's win this war rapidly, quickly. 4 years is quite an extension. This didn't work out for Lincoln, but you don't want to have to mess around with something like this for an extended period, especially when foreign countries might get interested. Number 5, defend and keep open United States rivers. The map here is of rivers in the U.S. Major thoroughfares during the Civil War were the Mississippi River, and the Ohio River here. But you can see there's lots of rivers that required some maintenance, protection. Also remember, there weren't a lot of roads in this day, and railroads were minimal. They were beginning to be built. The way to navigate around the United States in 1861 was on rivers or by waterways. Canals had been built. So transportation, movement of troops and goods, etc. Rivers were very necessary. So number 5, keep United States rivers open. Number 6, capture and defeat Confederate armies, as opposed to another military strategy, which says the purpose of war is to capture territory. Lincoln is saying, we want to defeat their armies so they can't fight. The heck with conquering territory. And finally, Lincoln's strategy, number 7, slave states need to be kept loyal if they did not secede. And there were slave states that did not secede from the Union. And they are outlined here in red: Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware. And these slave states need to be kept on the side of the North. So how are you going to do that? Well, Lincoln's number 1 strategy was he's not going to abolish slavery. He wants to keep these border states, as they were called, wants to keep them loyal to the North. So here's a quick review. Keep foreign nations at bay. The president is in command of the military. That was a relatively new item. Defend the capital city of Washington, D.C. Win the war rapidly. That didn't happen. Keep rivers open. The South controlled, the southern end of the Mississippi River, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit and what happened there and how that made a general very famous, keeping the Mississippi River open. Defeat armies. It's not about capturing territories. And non-seceded slave states, keep them loyal to the North. Next thing we're going to talk about is one of the Civil War generals, so prominent during the first year of the war, George B. McClellan. Lincoln appointed McClellan to be head of the army, and it was very soon that 2 major agreements or disagreements came about between McClellan, the general, and Lincoln, the commander-in-chief. Number 1 was for Lincoln was we need to defend Washington, D.C. We can't allow the capital to be captured or burned down or, whatever else might happen. So the capital city needs to be protected. McClellan, who Lincoln has named head of the army, is saying, no, we need to use troops in battles. We don't need to be defending the capital city. So right away, you get a disagreement here between Commander-in-Chief Lincoln and General McClellan. Lincoln says we need to take immediate action, start attacking. McClellan says, no, we can't just start attacking. We need to build up troops, get a good-sized army and train it well and have it supplied. And so Lincoln's going, start attacking. McClellan's going, give me more. Lincoln fires McClellan in July of 1862. So this is more than a year after the war had begun. And it was due to McClellan's almost total lack of action on the battlefield. And firing is kind of an overstatement. What he did was he demoted McClellan, but that's the equivalent of firing a general. You put them in a position where they have no power. And that's what happened with McClellan. In 1864, McClellan would become famous as an opponent to Lincoln. So the Democratic Party, Lincoln had been a Republican and nominated and elected in 1860 from that party. So now McClellan says, I want to run against this guy. He treated me like crud. So the Democrats nominate McClellan, and he runs against Lincoln in 1864. Now, the nominee for the Republican Party is John C. Fremont. Well, what about Lincoln? He was a Republican. Well, Republicans thought he's moving too slow on slavery. He doesn't want it to be an issue. Lincoln does not get the Republican Party nomination, despite the fact that the Republican Party has frequently called itself the Party of Lincoln. They got rid of Lincoln in 1864. Lincoln formed a third party called the National Union Party, and he won the election as a third party candidate. Civil War continuing, replacing generals is what we're going to talk about next. McClellan's difficulties for Lincoln persisted even when he got demoted, and the hope was that would keep him quiet. McClellan was involved in the Battle of Antietam, and when the Confederates were retreating from that battle, which the North had won, Lincoln told the generals, McClellan included, pursue these guys. They're running away from us. Now's the perfect time to win this battle even bigger. And McClellan refused to follow that order from Lincoln. Lincoln replaces McClellan with the gentleman pictured here, Ambrose Burnside. A lot of interesting bearding going on in the 1860s. And here's Ambrose Burnside. You can see he's got an interesting set of whiskers. What's really interesting about it is people began to reverse his last name. And that's how Sideburns got their name, was from General Ambrose Burnside. I've always really liked word origins. They're pretty interesting. You can look them up online. You can buy books on word origins, where they came from, etc. Burnside was ordered not to engage Confederates in the state of Virginia by Lincoln. Leave Virginia alone. We got other places we need to be doing work. Burnside attacked into Virginia anyway, despite Lincoln's desires. Now you can see here, these generals are, hey, we've always been in charge throughout the history of this nation when there's been a war. Now we got a president telling us what to do. So they're not going to follow his desires. They tend to act on their own or directly disobey what the president is saying. As a consequence, Lincoln replaces Burnside with General Joseph Hooker, shown here. Hooker had a lot of young women accompanying his soldiers. And guess what? We got another word origin here. They came to be called hookers after General George Hooker. That's kind of a, well, it's a difficult thing to discuss, I guess. It deals with sex, but I still like word origins anyway. Civil War, desertions during the Civil War. Civil War losses were huge. It was open field battles, much as had been fought throughout the Middle Ages all over Europe. You had two armies facing each other across an open field, and they would march toward each other. And they had swords, picks, and they had bows and arrows. And the battle would be over in a few hours, or sometimes they'd last 2 or 3 days, but generally there was a winner pretty rapidly. Here's an example of a medieval battlefield. Here you can see spears, this long thing here. Here's a guy with a sword. Here's the sword. And that was the extent of weaponry, pretty much, along with arrows. So open field battle continues, but the weapons changed dramatically by the time of the Civil War, and the strategy of marching toward each other across an open battlefield, now with new weaponry, creates tremendous losses. You've now got rifles, in some cases repeating rifles, and you have cannons. The destruction to personnel, using the old war strategy of marching toward each other across an open field, becomes quite a difficulty for the loss of human life because of the advancement of weaponry. Losses were heavy during the Civil War. 620,000 is the minimum guess by historians, 850,000 soldiers as casualties. You know, that includes wounding and taken prisoner and killed, etc. At the time, 1861 to 65, this amount of deaths is around 2.5% of the total population of the United States. Let's compare that to World War II. US losses were at 400,000, as much as half the amount lost during the United States Civil War. And those 400,000 compared to the population as a whole in the 1940s is 0.3% of the population died during the war. Civil War is the bloodiest war in US history. This is the most losses the United States has ever suffered in any war, both in terms of actual numbers and percent of the population that was killed. This is the worst in our history to the present day. These massive casualties led to a lot of desertions during the Civil War. And here's a book about desertion during the Civil War, available on Amazon for $18.68 by Dr. Ella Lon. So lots of desertions. The picture on the book is a soldier who was deserting, being hung for deserting. He was trying to get away from what many considered certain death. New strategy. We can't have these guys marching toward each other in warfare. So let's dig trenches and we'll hold the position. And that might make losses less, and also made battles last longer. So the Civil War saw the beginning of trench warfare. Hold troops in their place. Don't march them across a field toward each other. By World War I, this was the new standard of warfare, was dig trenches and hold your positions. 3 major battles during the Civil War. Still have allergies all the time, so I'll need to cough and sip occasionally. 3 major battles. Lincoln planned these battles. He said, this is where I want you generals to go with your troops. And they include Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg. And we're going to take a look at each one of them. Chancellorsville is a city in Virginia, and this battle lasted 7 days, much longer than the few hours of the Middle Ages, or even maybe 2 or 3 days of a battle during the Middle Ages. It was 30 April to May 6th of 1863, with Joseph Hooker in charge. The Confederates won this battle at Virginia. They had lots of troops available. They were concerned about their capital being taken over. Here's a map of Virginia up in the upper right, and you can see where the star is. That's Chancellorsville, and you can see it's in the northern end of the state of Virginia. The Confederates win under the famous Confederate general Stonewall Jackson, who was killed during the Civil War. Hooker resigns as a result of this loss, and he's replaced by General George Meade. Here's a book called The Battle of Chancellorsville. There's a lot more books that I'm recommending during this lecture because the Civil War is a gigantically popular war in U.S. history. Lots has been written about the Civil War and its major battles and strategies and who did what and so on and so forth. And you can look these books up about the Civil War online. You can go into a bookstore and they'll generally have lots of books on the Civil War. It's a very popular item. Second is Gettysburg, which is located in Virginia. Here you can see this is a map of the state of Pennsylvania. Gettysburg is on the very far southern border of Virginia, right there. This is a battle that lasted 3 days, from July 1st to July 3rd of 1863. It was 2 armies marching toward each other each day, so using the old medieval tactics with the modern weapons. And George Meade is in charge of this Battle of Gettysburg, which was won by Union forces. It is the decisive battle of the Civil War. Almost everyone considers this to be the battle that won the war for the North. And I'm going to talk to you about the 1st Minnesota, which played a hugely decisive battle during the Civil War. Lots of people say what the 1st Minnesota did is what should be remembered from the Civil War and from the Battle of Gettysburg, not Pickett's charge, where the Southerners charged the North during Gettysburg. For some reason, that's what's gotten remembered. So let's talk about this 1st Minnesota. It was a regiment. 215 men were killed, wounded, or missing. 47 were killed, 121 were wounded, and 90 were missing. And again, this is a Minnesota regiment. There were 262 men in the regiment. So you've got 215 casualties. This is an 82% loss rate on casualties. To this day, the highest number of losses in U.S. history in a single encounter or in or for a single regiment. That's a picture of Civil War battle from Gettysburg. 1st Minnesota with 262 soldiers. The issue is, how did they lose so many, 82%? There was a Union general, and he was just a little ways away from the 1st Minnesota. And he saw coming across the Gettysburg battlefield, 1,200 Confederates in a charge. He looked over, "Who are you over there?" "We're the 1st Minnesota." He said, "Charge and stop those people from getting onto this side of the battlefield." 262 soldiers charged 1,200 Confederates. Well, you can about imagine why the losses, wounding, killing, disappearing, not heard from again, were at 82%. Kind of an untold story of the Civil War. Third is Vicksburg, located in Mississippi. Here is a map of the state of Mississippi. Its border on the west is the Mississippi River. And here's Vicksburg. You control Vicksburg, you're controlling the Mississippi River, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, if I can still call it the Gulf of Mexico. I guess there's people that want it called the Gulf of America nowadays. The Union general in charge of the Battle of Vicksburg was Ulysses Grant. And this really wasn't a battle. It was a surrounding of the city known as a seizure. And this lasted for 47 days. And look, it ended on July 4th of 1863, the day after Gettysburg ended, which is considered the decisive battle. This also was a big deal battle. And it's where Ulysses Grant, a little known general who got credit for the win here at Vicksburg and the opening up of the Mississippi River, now he becomes a national hero. Newspapers across the country are writing stories about Grant and this guy that opened up the Mississippi River, divided the South partially in half. You know, the smaller portion of the South, like Texas, for instance, and Oklahoma, got cut off from the rest of the southern states, the eastern southern states. Grantsburg or Gettysburg is the world decisive battle, as I've already talked about. South wins the Civil War. What would have happened if the South had won the Civil War? If Gettysburg had been won by the South, let's say? Well, we'd probably have two nations in the US today. Lots of historians and political scientists and analysts of this stuff say it maybe wouldn't have been two nations, might have been several nations. The South believed in states' rights. What if each of the 13 southern states had become a separate nation, or joined forces and maybe become four nations among them instead of just the Confederacy and the United States? So you're all of a sudden, where the United States currently exists, you could have two nations. Some say territories. These are territories over here in the West. Territories would then have become separate nations, would not have allowed the United States to maintain them as territories. So you got northern territories up here in dark blue, or I mean the north in dark blue, and they're out west also, and the south here in orange. And you can see these territories here, these kind of tannish or light orange colored ones are in the south, and these blues in the north. Here are 15 world decisive battles outlined by single historian, Grezzi, who published in the 1850s. And this is just a list. I'm not going to spend any time talking about them, but some of them are very familiar. Battle of Marathon in 490, and the Battle of Tours was very famous in 732. It allowed Muslims in from Africa. Battle of Hastings, France invaded England, and here the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, where Napoleon was finally placed in check and no longer was a threat to other European countries. If you're interested in knowing about world decisive battles, there's a book there are books about these battles, and a book written by the guy who came up with the idea too. Let's take a look at the 1862 midterm elections. 1860, 1864, you got presidential elections. Then in the middle of that, you have elections to Congress, both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Many governorships are open during these off presidential election years. Frequently, the party in power in the presidency, they lose seats in Congress during these off-year elections. So let's take a look at what happened in the 1862 midterm elections during the Lincoln presidency and during the Civil War. Lincoln allies in the Republican Party saw major losses. People didn't like the way the war was going. They didn't like that Lincoln wasn't doing much about ending slavery. They moved to other parties. We're going to take a look at 7 reasons for these Republican losses in 1862. Number 1 was inflation. Inflation was very high, led to high prices. This is generally a major fault of capitalism. You get prices that you just don't know where they're going. There are European countries with heavily controlled economies where people are making the same amount of money as they were at the end of World War II, $5,000 a year. That a lot of that has begun to change as right wing has elections. Winners from the right wing have been winning in European elections. And so I don't know, keep your eye on the news, I guess, for what happens in those midterm elections and with inflation. But in a controlled economy, you generally don't have inflation that is nearly as radical as it is in capitalist economies. Taxes on goods increased to support the war. A tax on income was unconstitutional. The founding fathers said you cannot directly tax the people, and that's what a tax on their income is. You can tax them on stuff they buy, and that's what was being done. These are known as excise taxes. That was one of the ways, along with tariffs, which was a tax on imports. These were the major 2 ways that the federal government in the United States got money to support itself, and in particular, to fight wars. Number 3, there was a lot of talk about this, but it was a reality also. There was lots of corruption, government officials getting contracts to corporate leaders and getting kickbacks in return. It was war profiteering. Frequently, and to this day, corporations say to the federal government, here, we'll give you this vice president of our corporation. All you have to do is pay him $1 a year. Well, then you got a lot of corporate people who are interested in maintaining good, advantageous positions for their corporation, working within the federal government for 1 or 2 years. And so this corruption, especially during warfare, during the Civil War, who gets contracts to build the weaponry and supplies, etc., was a big deal. And generally, prices really skyrocket, as we've already talked about with inflation. A fourth item that led to Republican losses was the suspension of habeas corpus, which is guaranteed in the Constitution. What's habeas corpus? Latin term for if you arrest somebody, you've got to charge them with a crime and you've got to bring them to trial. You can't just arrest somebody and hold them. I mean, this was done by England, and that's why it was written into the Constitution. Was there were people in the colonies here in the present day United States who were arrested by England, spent a year in jail, never charged with a crime, never brought to trial. Hence, the founding fathers of the United States said, we're going to see to it that if you're arrested, you must be charged with a crime or released. If you're charged with a crime, you must be brought to trial. Today, the standard is 72 hours. You're arrested. If you're not charged with a crime within 72 hours, you need to be released. Item 5 of the 7 reasons for the 1862 Republican losses in the midterm elections. Freed and escaped slaves now during the Civil War. They were heading north in huge numbers because they knew that I've escaped or I've been freed by federal troops who have captured the area where I was held as a slave. So I'm going to get out of here, and they'd head north. This affected the job market in the North. A lot of the businesses were more than willing to hire ex-slaves for far less money than they were having to pay white folks living in those northern states. So job availability became a difficulty. Today, many say we have this situation with Hispanics moving north, and by Hispanics I mean Central America, South America, and I also mean Mexico. Mexico is considered to be a part of North America, but if we include Mexico, Central and South America, the United States has done 90 different invasions in those areas, and oftentimes to aid U.S. corporations, coffee, sugar, etc., fruits. And what happens then is corporations, and with the support of the U.S. government, had during the 18 and 1900s set up dictatorships in these Central and South American countries. A two-class system existed. They would provide us with very inexpensive sugar, and rum could be made from the processing of sugar, etc. So we created a lot of difficult situations through Central and South America. Now their people want to get away from that two-class system, and they're moving northward. And it's become a presidential campaign issue in the United States, and has been for a while. Item number 6. The first military draft was started during the Civil War. So the Union Army was now in large part a non-voluntary army. You were drafted into service in the military. Lincoln announced a plan, this is item 7, our final item, to free slaves in states not yet conquered by the North. If you're still seceded from the Union, and we have not conquered you from the North, then we're going to free the slaves in your area. This would be called the Emancipation Proclamation. And he issued this 6 weeks before the election. Well, it was an attempt to win these elections, these off-year elections in 1862, because it looks like he's getting tough on slavery now. So in the North, they're going to be electing Republicans. It didn't happen. It didn't make that kind of a difference. Let's take a look, review here about 1862 midterm elections, why Republicans lost, inflation, high prices, taxes on goods, excise taxes in particular, government and corporate relationships that were corrupt in nature. Habeas corpus had been suspended by Lincoln. Freed slaves were taking jobs in the North. The first military draft occurred, and some slaves were to be freed, and that was having difficulties in the North with jobs. Well, the Emancipation Proclamation, which now has been decreed 6 weeks, or it's been announced that, hey, I'm going to do this. We're going to take a look at it again here. First, the intro. The U.S. Constitution approves of slavery. So slavery can only be ended with a constitutional amendment, which was the case, the 13th Amendment. Lincoln could not end slavery with a presidential proclamation. That would be a single individual overturning a part of the Constitution. Lincoln and Generals on Emancipation Proclamation. It was released on July 1st of 1863. After conquering in the Confederacy, territorial generals would often be set up by the North. So you conquer a part of the Confederacy and you move a person in there who becomes a territorial governor. Usually these were generals. So you got a northerner now in charge of reconquered areas. One thing that they often did was they would release a document freeing all the slaves because they wanted abolition of slavery. Generals did this also. They'd conquer a large area and they'd say, okay, all the slaves in this area we just conquered are freed. Lincoln said, no, you can't do that. I'm reversing that. You don't have the power to do it. The power to do that rests with me to free some slaves in an area that's reconquered. Lincoln reversed these generals who made these sorts of decisions. He saw his power to be only in the freeing of some slaves, not all slaves. And again, he had a constitutional argument that he could make because slavery is supported in the Constitution. You can't get rid of it by a general saying so overall anyway, or a president saying so overall. Territorial ban, as it's concerned in the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, this means what happens in territories. Okay, here's the northern states in this kind of whitish cream color. Here are territories of the United States in this light tan color. So 1862, Congress banned slavery in all of these U.S. territories that are tan in color. Congress was passing laws like every time a slave state comes into the Union, a free state gets to come in too. And that way slave states can maintain power in the Senate because each state gets 2 senators. And So you got 26 senators from slave states. You'll have 26 senators from free states also. And that way, slavery can't be ended very easily. So Congress bans slavery in U.S. territories. Supporters and opponents to the Emancipation Proclamation. This is Horace Greeley pictured here with neck whiskers. And he founded the New York Tribune and then was its owner and publisher for several decades. He was an abolitionist, so he and Lincoln had trouble. But he did support the Emancipation Proclamation because it was going to free slaves in areas that were not yet conquered by the North. So a major portion of the South had not yet been reconquered. Those slaves would now be freed. Lincoln wrote to Greeley, the abolitionist, and said, "My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union and is to not either to save or end slavery. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps the Union." So here, Greeley, with a lot of power, who's writing articles about abolitionists or having other people write them about abolition of slavery in his newspaper, articles that are picked up by other newspapers and local papers who reprint them. And since Greeley is a major voice in abolitionist movement, Lincoln writes to him and tells him, "For me, it's about saving the Union. It's not about ending slavery." The Copperheads, they were an anti-war Northern group. They were opposed to going to war with the South. Let the South go its own way. Why should we have a war over this issue? And as to the Emancipation Proclamation, the Copperhead politician said it's a barrier to ending the war. We don't want the war to exist at all. Now you're going to free slaves. That'll keep the South fighting even longer and harder. Here's a copperhead snake down here. And it's where they got their name from, is because they were outspoken kind of, and poisonous, according to the people that believed the war was about preservation of the Union. And here's a barrier, that this would be a barrier to ending the war. Emancipation Proclamation, preliminary proclamation in September of 1862. This is just before the 1862 election. Lincoln announces what this proclamation would say and that it would be released on January 1st of 1863. Here's what it's going to say, 3 items. Slaves freed in all areas not under Union control. If your state or a portion of your state is under Union control, the slaves there will remain slaves, but the slaves in the part that are still under Confederate control will be freed. Item number 2, here's a map of the U.S. showing all the counties. And Lincoln says in this release in September of 62, he says, "I will specify counties within southern states where slaves will be freed if that entire state has not been conquered." So this Emancipation Proclamation is quite lengthy when it starts listing counties within states where the Emancipation Proclamation will take effect. Escaped slaves will be freed, item number 3, and they can serve in the Union Army. This added 50,000 soldiers to the Union Army. They were all segregated. They had quite different jobs to do, but slaves were now going to be allowed to be part of the Union Army. And I mean, 50,000, it made a difference of 50,000 troops. Again, 6 weeks before the 1862 off-year election is when the proposal was made and would be released in January. This was an attempt to get abolitionists out to vote by Lincoln. Lincoln thought this will sound good to abolitionists, I'm freeing slaves. But it didn't work that way. Didn't work for Lincoln. Abolitionists said it didn't go far enough. Let's take a look at the proclamation itself. 1863. Did the Emancipation Proclamation abolish slavery? No, it did not. It freed slaves in territories not yet conquered by the North. So if it freed slaves in these territories that were unconquered, it maintained slavery in states that never seceded and in conquered slave areas. So remember, we had those 5 states, border states, that had slavery but never seceded. Slavery is maintained in those border states and that never seceded. And slavery continues in all the areas that have been conquered by the North. So, seceded areas reconquered where slaves were not freed. In the state of Virginia, slaves were freed in 55 counties in Virginia and in 2 cities. There were 95 counties in Virginia. So you can see this is a bit more than half of the state of Virginia had slaves freed. Then in Louisiana, there are 12 parishes. That's what they call a county in Louisiana, is a parish. There are 64 such parishes in Louisiana. The city of New Orleans was also part of the agreement. So 12 parishes in Louisiana and the city of New Orleans. Areas that never seceded could maintain slavery, basically 4 states, Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, plus slave trade had always been allowed in Washington, D.C. They had auctions there in Washington, D.C. Oh, how's our time to work? When was slavery abolished in the United States? Guess what? It never has been. We think, well, of course it has. Here's the 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States. If you're a convicted criminal, you can be treated as a slave in the United States, according to the 13th Amendment. This is why chain gangs existed. They were common in the early 1900s. Criminals were slaves. The state was responsible for imprisoning them, and the state could make some money by hiring them out to corporations. Oh, Mr. Railroad, you need some help building your railroad? Good, pay us $1 a week, and we'll give you 150 slaves or whatever agreement they would come to. Criminals were paid nothing, or if they were paid, which did happen sometimes, it would be way below what the minimum wage was, or below what the common wage was at the time. that the chain gangs existed. Here's a picture of a chain gang building a railroad for a private corporation. And this is showing, this is a picture, it's all Black people convicted of a crime, but chain gangs included white people also. And you can still have slavery if you're convicted in the United States for people convicted of a crime. So Lincoln's major concern about slavery, if it's abolished, the South will fight harder and longer. Gettysburg Address. One of the most famous addresses worldwide, certainly the most famous address in the United States. I got a couple photos here about it. Here is a picture, and it has been determined the person inside this red square here is Abraham Lincoln. I don't know. Doesn't look like it to me. Here's the photo. I've enlarged it. Here it is, and you can see there's Lincoln sitting in with a bunch of people waiting to deliver his 2-minute address at Gettysburg. Some people say, well, here's another picture, and it shows Lincoln giving the speech. Well, look at over here. There's a sign on a barn advertising Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola didn't come into existence for several decades yet, into the 1890s even. So this is some other event. Ulysses Grant becomes commander of Union forces. That's the next thing that we're going to talk about. Here's a picture of Grant, who would eventually serve 2 terms as president of the United States. Lincoln really liked Grant. Grant fought. Grant would attack. And other officers were very critical, other generals, of Grant, because he had high casualty rates, which was the nature of the Civil War due to changes in technology, but no changes in battle planning. And Lincoln liked that. Lots of people didn't like it, even professional military people. Lincoln stated very simply about Grant, he fights. Major negative concern about Grant was all the attention he was getting. Here's a book about Grant by Ron Chernow. Grant had a very, very low rating among presidential historians. And Chernow, writing this book, I don't know, 15 years ago or more, he really said, hey, let's take a look at Grant, look at some of the great things he did. And this book describes that sort of thing. So Lincoln goes, okay, there's newspaper articles about Grant all across the country. I don't like that. He might run against me in the 1864 election. He might try to get the Republican nomination, etc. Grant knew about this concern of Lincoln's, and he told Lincoln that he had no intention of running for president in 1864. So don't worry about it. Lincoln orders Grant to attack and destroy 4 major facilities: bridges, railroads, roadways, and private plantations. So destroy their infrastructure, basically, is what Lincoln orders Grant to do, knowing that Grant is one of the very few generals, if not the only one, that will get the job done and follow the orders of the commander-in-chief. Repeating rifles. This is J.W. Ripley, a general in the United States Army, and he was the chief of ordnance. Well, what's ordnance? Here, follow me down here. Ordnance is weaponry, it's ammunition, it's vehicles that are used in combat, it's tools to maintain saddles and vehicles, etc., carriages, and so forth, and other equipment necessary to war. Ripley was told about repeating rifles, and he refused to use them. He didn't order any. He knew about them. He said, we're not going to use those in the Civil War. He had 4 objections. One was the gun is much heavier than a single shot musket, or even a single shot bullet where you have to reload it every time, you know. So soldiers are going to refuse to carry it. So I don't want repeating rifles. They're too heavy. Parts of the ammunition have not been tested properly. Who knows what'll happen? Will the guns explode as a result of the ammunition killing our soldiers? At any rate, we don't want to start using something like a repeating rifle that we don't have enough research on. And it has too many moving parts. Stuff will fall apart. Something breaks. The odds of something breaking when you got 40 parts versus 15 parts is much higher. And then you got a weapon that doesn't work. And so too many moving parts. Fourth and final objection is it costs too much. That's way too expensive an item. Some, however, were being used. So this is Ripley, J.W. Ripley, General. Repeating rifles are too heavy. Ammunition's not tested. Too many moving parts, and they cost too much. When Lincoln found out about this, he immediately started the manufacture of repeating rifles. Overrode Ripley's concerns. He said, no, that's exactly what we need. Yeah, we got a few more minutes. Good. The next thing we're going to do is talk about the Hampton Roads Conference. Now, it's early 1865. It's quite obvious the North is going to win this war. The Confederates see defeat coming their way, so they request of Lincoln a conference where, you know, of course, what the South would have said is, okay, we want to be a separate nation and we'll stop fighting you folks. Well, at the conference that Lincoln was a part of, it's very demeaning to the Southern Confederates. They didn't like what he was saying or arguing for. Consequently, the Hampton Roads Conference came to nothing. The war ended in April of 1865, but 4 months earlier during this conference, it did not get ended. Lincoln knew he'd won it. Why make concessions? April 9th, 1865, Lee surrenders to Grant. And here's a couple of, on the left are photographs of the two gentlemen, and on the right, a painting of them meeting, shaking hands, and Lee surrenders for the South. The election of 1864, let's take a look at it. Republicans. A lot of Republicans, probably a majority, not many Republicans, but most Republicans, in other words, were opposed to Lincoln because of his position on slavery as being way too soft. Lincoln opponents wanted abolition. Lincoln had no chance of getting the Republican nomination, which, as we've mentioned earlier, went to this gentleman, John C. Fremont. He had been their nominee in 1856. He was an abolitionist, nominated by the Republicans in 1864. Let's take a look at what happens with the Democrats in 1864. They are a split party. There are war Democrats, they want to keep fighting, and there are peace Democrats, they never wanted a war. They said, leave it alone, let's stop, let's back out of this war immediately. Don't keep fighting. The peace Democrats are saying, let the South go its own way. Let them figure out what they want to do. We got a country up here in the North that's more rational and moral, etc. Democrats, the nominee was George B. McClellan. He gets to run against Lincoln. And so the war Democrats really kind of win the day at the convention by nominating a general to run for president, a general who Lincoln had fired, actually demoted for not fighting. Here's a photograph of him. He's called for the repeal of the Emancipation Proclamation as the Democratic nominee. Democrats had a platform, and it included the peace Democrats. They wrote it. So the war Democrats controlled who got the nomination, but the peace Democrats controlled the platform of the party. And they called for the war to end, so all hostilities to stop, negotiate a peace immediately. Then the National Union Party, they nominated Abraham Lincoln. The issue for them was preservation of the Union, kind of like preservation of the vegetables, there, according to these folks. Election results. Here's Abraham Lincoln, 2.2 million popular votes, 55.1%, and 212 electoral votes. McClellan, 1.8 million popular votes, 44.9%. Lincoln won by 10.2%, an incredible margin of victory, and got 90% of the electoral votes. John C. Fremont, the Republican Party, dropped out of the race. So, don't anybody vote for me, forget about it. We don't have a chance. So Lincoln won big time, 10.2% popular vote. What is a landslide? A landslide is anything that is 5% or larger. Here's the 2024 election. The margin was 1.5%. So it's not a landslide for Trump. And it wasn't even a majority of voters that voted for him. That's been common throughout most of American history. You get almost a majority, the winner does. But anyway, kind of interesting because we're hearing claims that this was a radical win, a big time win, etc. Fact is, by definition of historians and political scientists, that is not the case. McClellan won just 3 states, Delaware, Kentucky, and New Jersey. And Lincoln's large victory, what was that due to? The war was won by 1864. It was looking pretty good in November. William Sherman, pictured here, General Sherman, had burned the entire city of Atlanta 2 months before the election. And here's a picture of him in that Napoleonic pose. Napoleon always put his hand inside his suit coat, see? And here we are, 50 years after Napoleon, And that's the pose that most people are using all the time. Uh, when we meet next time, a week from today, I'm going to talk to you about James Speed, somebody no one has ever heard of, but he's involved in something very famous. And I think we now need to move to questions. Okay, Kay, do we have any? Or
That we do. We have, let's see. So let's see, regarding armaments in the Civil War, we talked about the repeating rifle, but the Gatling gun was invented in 1861, I think.
yeah.
Was that used in any of the open field fighting?
Yes, and that was a gun where you would crank it. It was more like a cannon, but it shot bullets, and you could crank it and you'd put out tons of bullets in a short amount of time. And it's
Mhm.
named for the inventor, whose last name was Gatling. Yeah. And I'm not sure when it first came into use during the Civil War. I mean, I don't know. I
Yeah,
could,
I just know that it was invented at some point in 1861.
yes.
So, um, in terms of Lincoln being the US president as commander in chief, was he truly one of the last ones who actually had command of the army? I mean, in terms of ordering certain battles, things like that, um,
Well,
to this extent.
yeah, he set that standard of playing a major role in warfare once it started. Previous generals or previous presidents had not done that. And the president is seen as a major, matter of fact, they're so major a leader over the last 80 years that they don't even go to Congress anymore to get wars approved. They pretty much just say, okay, we got a war going. Let's get troops to Iran, Iraq, uh, Chile. We invaded. The president of Chile was, depending on who you talk to, murdered or committed suicide, and that was under Nixon. And there's been a tremendous amount of warfare since December 8th of 1941, which was the last constitutionally uh, uh, guaranteed war.
Okay. Um, why do you think most American textbooks or history textbooks, I don't know how recent here, claim that the Emancipation Proclamation was said abolish slavery in America? Just an easier way to
Yep.
report it?
Recently, I was watching a lecture on my computer, and it was a college professor. And he talked about, I mean, in one sentence, he simply said the Emancipation Proclamation abolished slavery. No, it didn't. That has become such a strong belief that it's one of the things about Lincoln that really isn't true. He did not abolish slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation. And I feel like today's lecture, I pointed that out. And
Yeah,
it's,
I mean, I think you could argue that the 13th Amendment abolished it because it's slavery and involuntary service, except in the case of like corporal punishment. Um, yeah, I probably said that wrong, but it's more so involuntary servitude would be prisoners having to do labor versus that being necessarily slavery if you want to then say that the 13th Amendment did abolish slavery, just not involuntary servitude, which is
yeah,
mincing words there.
although the language used in the 13th Amendment is the word slavery.
It uses both.
Yeah. Well, it
So,
says, yeah, unless convicted of well,
right.
it says slavery and then unless convicted of a criminal act, or crime. But yeah, it's, involuntary servitude is,
But yeah, it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States
yeah.
or any place subject to their jurisdiction.
Now,
So,
question is involuntary servitude one of those statements such as was used by George W. Bush to talk about torture? It's enhanced interrogation.
right,
Uh, Involuntary servitude has a lot of likeness to slavery.
slavery.
But yeah, anyhow, well, it's an interesting point. But
Yeah,
but the Emancipation Proclamation certainly did not abolish slavery.
right. As one person asks here, it's like saying for border states in the Emancipation Proclamation, I assume she says that Lincoln maintained slavery because he wanted to keep the border states in the Union.
Yeah,
However, for captured slavery, why wouldn't he want to free slaves?
because the war would go on longer, and and then those border states might secede. And
Mhm.
when those border states did not secede, they offered 40,000 troops to the Union Army. You'd have lost those troops.
Mhm.
They would have then become part of the Confederacy, and so
Okay. Somebody points out talking about getting into the war then, Ulysses S. Grant's two-volume autobiography is remarkable in its descriptions of his command style and the battles he fought. Um, just pointing that out, and I'm like going, if anyone is interested in that, that is the personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, General Ulysses S. Grant, and you can look that up, and it is available in some library systems like Hennepin County can always interlibrary loan those if you live in a different library system. Just wanted to point that out. Um, Also, it has the term, do we use the term the War of Northern Aggression? And it being in the North, I think we don't hear that as much. That is probably a phrase from the South that someone's asking about. Um, And okay, in the two elections, how did the Congress change and how did the impact of Lincoln's ability to how did it change the impact of Lincoln's ability to prosecute his objectives? Was there a huge swing?
well, the war was over,
Okay.
basically. It
Yeah,
was
I suppose it'd be more so the midterm election would have.
yeah, in the 1864 election, in 6 months, the war was over from November to April. Uh,
Mhm.
those midterm elections, uh, there was no sense that the war was coming to an end soon. We were in the middle of it. And
Not a lot of impact in how Lincoln
yes,
operated. Okay.
sure, especially on the slavery issue, because that might have extended the war even longer. You know, he was worried about the South fighting harder and longer if slavery was abolished.
So, if slavery was constitutional during the Civil War, how could Congress mandate some states to be free of slavery when they joined the Union?
Yeah, they passed laws like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, for
Mhm.
instance, that said one state comes in as a slave state, you have to have another state come in as a free state. Now, that's not talking about the abolition of slavery. It's talking about the power balance in Congress so that slavery can be maintained, even.
Right. So, it didn't negate um,
Yeah,
slavery in the Constitution. It just kept
yeah.
it balanced more so. Um, okay. Now, McClellan in it was the 1864 election won some border states there. Was this because those states favored ending the war?
Uh, Well, I'd say, yeah, probably. He got votes in
Hmm.
every state, you know. He just got enough votes to win the state electoral votes in just 3 states. So,
Okay,
and also you got to remember 1864 election, it was only the North voting.
true.
Yeah, wasn't the South. So it was even less states than had voted in 1860.
You know. Okay, well, that was the last question. I'm just gonna talk about those three books that you mentioned at the beginning. Team of Rivals. Um, if you have Libby, which is, digital um, ebooks and e-audiobooks, it's on there both as a audiobook and digital book. We own 6 copies of the actual book at the Ramsey County Libraries. You can probably find those in most library systems. Lincoln by David Herbert Donald. Ramsey County Library only has 1 copy of that. There is an audio version available on Libby. And Lincoln at Gettysburg, more likely going to have to interlibrary loan that, as that is more at college libraries than it is at public libraries currently, but it is available out there in case you want to do it through the library. Otherwise, reminder that recordings from last week will be up by the end of this week. This one will probably be up sometime next week. And um, yeah, otherwise, we just want to thank you, JB, for all the information you've been sharing with us. Thank all of you for your questions and your time in joining us here. And we will see you next week on February 5th. Thanks, everyone.